grade bonds and, in some cases, high-grade preferred stocks. At the other extreme we have the well-to-do and experienced businessman, who will include any kind of bond or stock in his security list provided he considers it an attractive purchase. It has been an old and sound principle that those who cannot afford to take risks should be content with a relatively low return on their invested funds. From this there has developed the general notion that the rate of return which the investor should aim for is more or less proportionate to the degree of risk he is ready to run. Our view is different. The rate of return sought should be dependent, rather, on the amount of intelligent effort the investor is willing and able to bring to bear on his task. The minimum return goes to our passive investor, who wants both safety and freedom from concern. The maximum return would be realized by the alert and enterprising investor who exercises maximum intelligence and skill. In 1965 we added, in many cases there may be less real risk associated with buying a bargain issue offering the chance of a large profit than with a conventional bond purchase yielding about 41/2%. This statement had more truth in it than we ourselves suspected, since in subsequent years even the best long-term bonds lost a substantial part of their market value because of the rise in interest rates. The basic problem of bond stock allocation. We have already outlined in briefest form the portfolio policy of the defensive investor. He should divide his funds between high-grade bonds and high-grade common stocks. We have suggested as a fundamental guiding rule that the investor should never have less than 25% or more than 75% of his funds in common stocks, with a consequent inverse range of between 75% and 25% in bonds. There is an implication here that the standard division should be an equal 1, or 50-50, between the two major investment mediums. According to tradition, the sound reason for increasing the percentage in common stocks would be the appearance of the bargain price levels created in a protracted bear market. Conversely, sound procedure would call for reducing the common stock component below 50% when in the judgment of the investor the market level has become dangerously high. These copybook maxims have always been easy to enunciate and always difficult to follow, because they go against the very human nature which produces the excesses of bull and bear markets. It is almost a contradiction in terms to suggest as a feasible policy for the average stock owner that he lighten his holdings when the market advances beyond a certain point and add to them after a corresponding decline. It is because the average man operates, and apparently must operate, in opposite fashion that we have had the great advances and collapses of the past, and, this writer believes, we are likely to have them in the future. If the division between investment and speculative operations were as clear now as once it was, we might be able to envisage investors as a shrewd, experienced group who sell out to the heedless, hapless speculators at high prices and buy back from them at depressed levels. This picture may have had some verisimilitude in bygone days, but it is hard to identify it with financial developments since 1949. There is no indication that such professional operations as those of the mutual funds have been conducted in this fashion. The percentage of the portfolio held in equities by the two major types of funds, balanced and common stock, has changed very little from year to year. Their selling activities have been largely related to endeavors to switch from less to more promising holdings. If, as we have long believed, the stock market has lost contact with its old bounds, and if new ones have not yet been established, then we can give the investor no reliable rules by which to reduce his common stock holdings toward the 25% minimum and rebuild them later to the 75% maximum. We can urge that in general the investor should not have more than 1/2 in equities unless he has strong confidence in the soundness of his stock position and is sure that he could view a market decline of the 1969-70 type with equanimity. It is hard for us to see how such strong confidence can be justified at the levels existing in early 1972. Thus we would counsel against a greater than 50% apportionment to common stocks at this time. But, for complementary reasons, it is almost equally difficult to advise a reduction of the figure well below 50%, unless the investor is disquieted in his own mind about the current market level, and will be satisfied also to limit his participation in any further rise to, say, 25% of his total funds. We are thus led to put forward for most of our readers what may appear to be an oversimplified 50-50 formula. Under this plan, the guiding rule is to maintain as nearly as practicable an equal divvy between bond and stock holdings. When changes in the market level have raised the common stock component to, say, 55%, the balance would be restored by a sale of 1/11 of the stock portfolio and the transfer of the proceeds to bonds. Conversely, a fall in the common stock proportion to 45% would call for the use of 1/11 of the bond fund to buy additional equities. Yale University followed a somewhat similar plan for a number of years after 1937, but it was geared around a 35% normal holding in common stocks. In the early 1950s, however, Yale seems to have given up its once famous formula, and in 1969 held 61% of its portfolio in equities, including some convertibles. At that time, the endowment funds of 71 such institutions, totaling $7.6 billion, held 60.3% in common stocks. The Yale example illustrates the almost lethal effect of the great market advance upon the once popular formula approach to investment. Nonetheless, we are convinced that our 50-50 version of this approach makes good sense for their defensive investor. It is extremely simple, it aims unquestionably in the right direction. It gives the follower the feeling that he is at least making some moves in response to market developments. Most important of all, it will restrain him from being drawn more and more heavily into common stocks as the market rises to more and more dangerous heights. Furthermore, a truly conservative investor will be satisfied with the gains shown on half his portfolio in a rising market, while in a severe decline he may derive much solace from reflecting how much better off he is than many of his more venturesome friends. While our proposed 50-50 division is undoubtedly the simplest all-purpose program devisable, it may not turn out to be the best in terms of results achieved. Of course, no approach, mechanical or otherwise, can be advanced with any assurance that it will work out better than another. The much larger income return now offered by good bonds than by representative stocks is a potent argument for favoring the bond component. The investor's choice between 50% or a lower figure in stocks may well rest mainly on his own temperament and attitude. If he can act as a cold-blooded weigher of the odds, he would be likely to favor the low 25% stock component at this time, with the idea of waiting until the Dow Jones Industrial Average dividend yield was, say, 2/3 of the bond yield before he would establish his median 50-50 division between bonds and stocks. Starting from 900 for the Dow Jones Industrial Average and dividends of $36 on the unit, this would require either a fall in taxable bond yields from 71/2% to about 5.5% without any change in the present return on leading stocks, or a fall in the Dow Jones Industrial Average to as low as 660 if there is no reduction in bond yields and no increase in dividends. A combination of intermediate changes could produce the same buying point. A program of that kind is not especially complicated. The hard part is to adopt it and to stick to it, not to mention the possibility that it may turn out to have been much too conservative. The bond component. The choice of issues in the bond component of the investor's portfolio will turn about two main questions. Should he buy taxable or tax-free bonds, and should he buy shorter or longer-term maturities? The tax decision should be mainly a matter of arithmetic, turning on the difference in yields as compared with the investor's tax bracket. In January 1972, the choice in 20-year maturities was between obtaining, say, 71/2% on grade AA corporate bonds and 5.3% on prime tax-free issues. The term municipals is generally applied to all species of tax-exempt bonds, including state obligations. There was thus for this maturity a loss in income of some 30% in passing from the corporate to the municipal field. Hence, if the investor was in a maximum tax bracket higher than 30%, he would have a net saving after taxes by choosing the municipal bonds. The opposite, if his maximum tax was less than 30%. A single person starts paying a 30% rate when his income after deductions passes $10,000. For a married couple, their rate applies when combined taxable income passes $20,000. It is evident that a large proportion of individual investors would obtain a higher return after taxes from good municipals than from good corporate bonds. The choice of longer versus shorter maturities involves quite a different question, viz., does the investor want to assure himself against a decline in the price of his bonds, but at the cost of 1. A lower annual yield and 2. Loss of the possibility of an appreciable gain in principal value? We think it best to discuss this question in Chapter 8, The Investor and Market Fluctuations. For a period of many years in the past, the only sensible bond purchases for individuals were the U.S. savings issues. Their safety was, and is, unquestioned. They gave a higher return than other bond investments of first quality. They had a money-back option and other privileges which added greatly to their attractiveness. In our earlier editions we had an entire chapter entitled U.S. Savings Bonds, a boon to investors. As we shall point out, U.S. savings bonds still possess certain unique merits that make them a suitable purchase by any individual investor. For the man of modest capital, with, say, not more than $10,000 to put into bonds, we think they are still the easiest and the best choice. But those with larger funds may find other mediums more desirable. Let us list a few major types of bonds that deserve investor consideration, and discuss them briefly with respect to general description, safety, yield, market price, risk, income tax status, and other features. 1. U.S. Savings Bonds, Series E and Series H. We shall first summarize their important provisions, and then discuss briefly the numerous advantages of these unique, attractive, and exceedingly convenient investments. The Series H bonds pay interest semi-annually, as do other bonds. The rate is 4.29% for the first year, and then a flat 5.10% for the next 9 years to maturity. Interest on the Series E bonds is not paid out, but accrues to the holder through increase in redemption value. The bonds are sold at 75% of their face value, and mature at 100% in 5 years 10 months after purchase. If held to maturity, the yield works out at 5%, compounded semi-annually. If redeemed earlier, the yield moves up from a minimum of 4.01% in the first year to an average of 5.20% in the next 45/6 years. Interest on the bonds is subject to federal income tax, but is exempt from state income tax. However, federal income tax on the Series E bonds may be paid at the holder's option either annually as the interest accrues, through higher redemption value, or not until the bond is actually disposed of. Owners of Series E bonds may cash them in at any time, shortly after purchase, at their current redemption value. Holders of Series H bonds have similar rights to cash them in at par value, cost. Series E bonds are exchangeable for Series H bonds, with certain tax advantages. Bonds lost, destroyed, or stolen may be replaced without cost. There are limitations on annual purchases, but liberal provisions for co-ownership by family members make it possible for most investors to buy as many as they can afford. Comment: there is no other investment that combines 1. Absolute assurance of principal and interest payments, 2. The right to demand full money back at any time, and 3. Guarantee of at least a 5% interest rate for at least 10 years. Holders of the earlier issues of Series E bonds have had the right to extend their bonds at maturity, and thus to continue to accumulate annual values at successively higher rates. The deferral of income tax payments over these long periods has been of great dollar advantage. We calculate it has increased the effective net after-tax rate received by as much as a third in typical cases. Conversely, the right to cash in the bonds at cost price or better has given the purchasers in former years of low interest rates complete protection against the shrinkage in principal value that befell many bond investors. Otherwise stated, it gave them the possibility of benefiting from the rise in interest rates by switching their low interest holdings into very high coupon issues on an even money basis. In our view, the special advantages enjoyed by owners of savings bonds now will more than compensate for their lower current return as compared with other direct government obligations. 2. Other United States bonds. A profusion of these issues exists, covering a wide variety of coupon rates and maturity dates. All of them are completely safe with respect to payment of interest and principal. They are subject to federal income taxes but free from state income tax. In late 1971, the long-term issues, over 10 years, showed an average yield of 6.09%, intermediate issues, 3 to 5 years, returned 6.35%, and short issues returned 6.03%. In 1970 it was possible to buy a number of old issues at large discounts. Some of these are accepted at par in settlement of estate taxes. Example, the U.S. Treasury 31/2s due 1990 are in this category. They sold at 60 in 1970, but closed 1970 above 77. It is interesting to note also that in many cases the indirect obligations of the U.S. government yield appreciably more than its direct obligations of the same maturity. As we write, an offering appears of 7.05% of certificates fully guaranteed by the Secretary of Transportation of the Department of Transportation of the United States. The yield was fully 1% more than that on direct obligations of the U.S., maturing the same year, 1986. The certificates were actually issued in the name of the trustees of the Penn Central Transportation Co., but they were sold on the basis of a statement by the U.S. Attorney General that the guarantee brings into being a general obligation of the United States, backed by its full faith and credit. Quite a number of indirect obligations of this sort have been assumed by the U.S. government in the past, and all of them have been scrupulously honored. The reader may wonder why all this hocus-pocus, involving an apparently personal guarantee by our Secretary of Transportation, and a higher cost to the taxpayer in the end. The chief reason for the indirection has been the debt limit imposed on government borrowing by the Congress. Apparently guarantees by the government are not regarded as debts, a semantic windfall for shrewder investors. Perhaps the chief impact of this situation has been the creation of tax-free housing authority bonds, enjoying the equivalent of a U.S. guarantee, and virtually the only tax-exempt issues that are equivalent to government bonds. Another type of government-backed issues is the recently created new community debentures, offered to yield 7.60% in September 1971. 3. State and municipal bonds. These enjoy exemption from federal income tax. They are also ordinarily free of income tax in the state of issue but not elsewhere. They are either direct obligations of a state or subdivision, or revenue bonds dependent for interest payments on receipts from a toll road, bridge, building lease, etc. Not all tax-free bonds are strongly enough protected to justify their purchase by a defensive investor. He may be guided in his selection by the rating given to each issue by Moody's or Standard & Poor's. One of three highest ratings by both services, AAA, AA, or A, should constitute a sufficient indication of adequate safety. The yield on these bonds will vary both with the quality and the maturity, with the shorter maturities giving the lower return. In late 1971, the issues represented in Standard & Poor's Municipal Bond Index averaged AA in quality rating, 20 years in maturity, and 5.78% in yield. A typical offering of Vineland, New Jersey, bonds, rated AA4A and gave a yield of only 3% on the 1-year maturity, rising to 5.8% to the 1995 and 1996 maturities. 1. 4. Corporation bonds. These bonds are subject to both federal and state tax. In early 1972, those of highest quality yielded 7.19% for a 25-year maturity, as reflected in the published yield of Moody's AAA Corporate Bond Index. The so-called lower medium-grade issues, rated bar, returned 8.23% for long maturities. In each class, shorter-term issues would yield somewhat less than longer-term obligations. Comment. The above summaries indicate that the average investor has several choices among high-grade bonds. Those in high-income tax brackets can undoubtedly obtain a better net yield from good tax-free issues than from taxable ones. For others, the early 1972 range of taxable yield would seem to be from 5.00% on U.S. savings bonds, with their special options, to about 71.5% on high-grade corporate issues. Higher-yielding bond investments. By sacrificing quality, an investor can obtain a higher income return from his bonds. Long experience has demonstrated that the ordinary investor is wiser to keep away from such high-yield bonds. While, taken as a whole, they may work out somewhat better in terms of overall return than the first-quality issues, they expose the owner to too many individual risks of untoward developments, ranging from disquieting price declines to actual default. It is true that bargain opportunities occur fairly often in lower-grade bonds, but these require special study and skill to exploit successfully. Perhaps we should add here that the limits imposed by Congress on direct bond issues of the United States have produced at least two sorts of bargain opportunities for investors in the purchase of government-backed obligations. One is provided by the tax-exempt new housing issues, and the other by the recently created, taxable, new community debentures. An offering of new housing issues in July 1971 yielded as high as 5.8%, free from both federal and state taxes, while an issue of taxable, new community debentures sold in September 1971 yielded 7.60%. Both obligations have the full faith and credit of the United States government behind them and hence are safe without question. And, on a net basis, they yield considerably more than ordinary United States bonds. Savings deposits in lieu of bonds. An investor may now obtain as high an interest rate from a savings deposit in a commercial or savings bank, or from a bank certificate of deposit, as he can from a first-grade bond of short maturity. The interest rate on bank savings accounts may be lowered in the future, but under present conditions they are a suitable substitute for short-term bond investment by the individual. Convertible issues. These are discussed in Chapter 16. The price variability of bonds in general is treated in Chapter 8, the investor and market fluctuations. Call provisions. In previous editions we had a fairly long discussion of this aspect of bond financing, because it involved a serious but little noticed injustice to the investor. In the typical case, bonds were callable fairly soon after issuance, and at modest premiums, say 5%, above the issue price. This meant that during a period of wide fluctuations in the underlying interest rates, the investor had to bear the full brunt of unfavorable changes and was deprived of all but a meager participation in favorable ones. Example: our standard example has been the issue of American Gas and Electric 100-year 5% debentures, sold to the public at 101 in 1928. 4 years later, under near-panic conditions, the price of these good bonds fell to 621 halves, yielding 8%. By 1946, in a great reversal, bonds of this type could be sold to yield only 3%, and the 5% issue should have been quoted at close to 160. But at that point the company took advantage of the call provision and redeemed the issue at a mere 106. The call feature in these bond contracts was a thinly disguised instance of heads I win, tails you lose. At long last, the bond-buying institutions refused to accept this unfair arrangement. In recent years, most long-term high-coupon issues have been protected against redemption for 10 years or more after issuance. This still limits their possible price rise, but not inequitably. In practical terms, we advise the investor in long-term issues to sacrifice a small amount of yield to obtain the assurance of non-callability, say for 20 or 25 years. Similarly, there is an advantage in buying a low-coupon bond at a discount rather than a high-coupon bond selling at about par and callable in a few years. For the discount, for example, of a 31/2% bond at 631/2%, yielding 7.85%, carries full protection against adverse call action, straight, that is, non-convertible, preferred stocks. Certain general observations should be made here on the subject of preferred stocks. Really good preferred stocks can and do exist, but they are good in spite of their investment form, which is an inherently bad one. The typical preferred shareholder is dependent for his safety on the ability and desire of the company to pay dividends on its common stock. Once the common dividends are omitted, or even in danger, his own position becomes precarious. For the directors are under no obligation to continue paying him unless they also pay on the common. On the other hand, the typical preferred stock carries no share in the company's profits beyond the fixed dividend rate. Thus the preferred holder lacks both the legal claim of the bondholder, or creditor, and the profit possibilities of a common shareholder, or partner. These weaknesses in the legal position of preferred stocks tend to come to the fore currently in periods of depression. Only a small percentage of all preferred issues are so strongly entrenched as to maintain an unquestioned investment status through all vicissitudes. Experience teaches that the time to buy preferred stocks is when their price is unduly depressed by temporary adversity. At such times they may be well suited to the aggressive investor but too unconventional for the defensive investor. In other words, they should be bought on a bargain basis or not at all. We shall refer later to convertible and similarly privileged issues, which carry some special possibilities of profits. These are not ordinarily selected for a conservative portfolio. Another peculiarity in the general position of preferred stocks deserves mention. They have a much better tax status for corporation buyers than for individual investors. Corporations pay income tax on only 15% of the income they receive in dividends, but on the full amount of their ordinary interest income. Since the 1972 corporate rate is 48%, this means that $100 received as preferred stock dividends is taxed only $7.20. Whereas $100 received as bond interest is taxed $48. On the other hand, individual investors pay exactly the same tax on preferred stock investments as on bond interest, except for a recent minor exemption.